All right, everybody. Hey, welcome back. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed what we've gotten so far. We've been talking a lot about some of these offensives and some of the bogging down, and especially that Eastern Front in Europe. When we were talking last about the Battle of Stalingrad, and then we were moving into kind of the Battle of the Atlantic, where, well, we see one of the longest parts of the war.
Well, yeah, just as a battle, it's bunches of little battles.
Yeah, right,
You know,
right.
submarine or even a wolf pack against a convoy.
And it makes it very drawn out. So today we're going to be focusing specifically on
Kursk. We're going to go to the Eastern Front, but it's to finish up last time. You know, we talked about these turning points. You know, Midway, Stalingrad, El Alamein, and really the Battle of the Atlantic.
right,
Especially as you get deep into 43, the Battle of the Atlantic is over.
right.
The Germans are still fighting, but the writing's on the wall.
Well,
The Allies are getting enough food and supplies across the Atlantic that it's not really. There's inconveniences when ships are sunk, as opposed to catastrophes.
right. Oh shoot, we didn't get the Tootsie Rolls that were on that carrier.
Yes, right.
Shucks.
You know, only the guys who lost their cigarettes and their coffee are really mad.
Right.
But the Axis powers don't realize they've lost the war because all these major battles are only turning points in a historian sense.
Right. Yes.
And yes, I'm sure that the naval commanders in the Pacific realized that something significant had changed at Midway.
I would assume
Because
yes.
the Japanese do start operating a little bit differently to protect their remaining carriers and those tender air wings.
Oh,
But logistically, they're in trouble. They're going to be on the defensive even if they don't want to admit it. But in the East, you know, that winter offensive, Operation Ulanus, that Zhukov and who was the other guy? Zhukov was the guy in charge of Stalingrad. Anyway, the Sixth Army surrenders. The Germans have to pull back quite a ways because, well, they've got this 600,000 man hole in their army.
right.
So that means you gotta have a better line.
Well, and they, by taking such a direct route into Stalingrad, it really does open up that vulnerability, right?
Oh well, I mean,
The line, of course, beyond
it went along the Volga up and down, but the problem is you're literally talking about what we would consider a third world country.
right.
Once you leave 30 miles from major cities, you're dirt roads and tracks,
Sure.
which is really hard to supply a modern mechanized, even for the Germans, which isn't by what we would consider modern mechanized army.
But then it was.
But it's still a lot more gas and things that you need. And 600,000 guys eat a lot.
yes, yes, I can imagine.
And we talked about that with the trying to resupply them when they're trapped.
Mm-hmm.
But then the Germans, of course, come up with their plan. They're going to push back. It's another time for this big offensive to try to cut off a big chunk of the Soviet army. And maybe this time, the dang thing will die.
And that's I cannot help but say I'm sorry. That's a dying dream.
Well, it's
The number of people that the Soviets can provide, even if they are not well-trained individuals, would easily outnumber any German line that they would have.
oh yeah, but I mean, the Germans, I'm sure, probably given the way the German staff work, they probably already had it down to a mathematical equation. How many
Good
German
point.
troops in an infantry division were worth compared to a Soviet army?
Good point.
I mean, so they were like, okay. And looking at it in retrospect, if the Battle of Kursk goes off exactly like the Germans won, which of course Barbarossa in 41 and Case Blue in 42 did go off really amazingly in their initial stages, cutting off huge chunks of that Soviet army.
Right.
If it works like they want it to, you're probably talking about the Soviet army losing another 2 million men.
Whew.
It might literally mean the end of the war for the Soviets, because they are, as we see, we don't know until after the war. In fact, some of the stuff we don't know until the 90s.
Right.
When
yeah.
the Iron Curtain falls. They're the dregs at the end of the war. They are taking clerks and cooks and putting them on tanks and saying go.
That's unreal.
We think of it as like this constant flow of men, but they are actually running out of combat age men. Because yeah, you can draft guys that are 50, but I can tell you what, we're only good for a day, and then we need a couple days off. If you're talking slogging through fields and stuff,
Sure.
it's going to be very difficult to get an army that needs arch supports.
Or some Bengay.
to try to take over Europe. It's just not going to work.
Not going to happen. Yeah, I understand that.
And the Germans have two new cards to play.
Oh, okay.
First is the Tiger. It came out in 42, but it hadn't really been deployed in numbers because it's very big and hard to build. It takes a lot of parts.
Now,
and it's the answer to the T-34.
Okay.
The Russians, the Germans ran into this in June of 41. When they invade, they ran into a few of these T-34s, and they looked at them like, oh, this thing's a monster.
Yeah.
It's big, it's got strong armor, guns a little small, but still effective.
Right.
Especially against smaller German tanks.
Right.
They're like, well, we're going to need a bigger gun. And if we need a bigger gun, we need a bigger tank. And if we want to have a bigger tank, we want more armor. So we have the Tiger, which is solidly built, armored fortress to walk across Europe in. It's slow, comparatively.
Sure.
But still, it's got wider treads, so now it can go cross country better.
That's better.
It's got great armor, pretty much immune to really almost its own gun, 88 millimeter.
Really?
At least from any distance. Obviously, up close, things get a
little haywire.
Yeah, you don't really want that. And this is what they build, but Germans, not being slackers in the old research and development department, also come up with the Panther tank.
Okay.
Which is basically a T-34, but German.
Oh.
It's faster. It's got a bigger engine, bigger gun, 76 millimeter.
Now, is this different than a Panzer? Or...
Well, a Panzer is just a tank.
Oh, okay.
Literally, that's what
that's German.
German for tank.
Okay.
And in fact, the Tiger is a Panther 6. And the Panther is a Tiger 4, or the Panther is a Panzer 5, and the Tiger is a Panzer 6.
I see.
They just keep going up the line.
I see now. Okay, I was
always
a little worried.
When they invaded Russia in 41, most of the tanks they used were Panzer 3s.
Okay,
and
small.
By the way, the little letter designator, Panzer 3 A, B, C, I think the last one they deployed was a J.
Wow.
So they were constantly playing with these things.
Trying to figure out how they
make
would
them
be able to...
better, stronger, faster. Every time they get a new engine, maybe it got 10, 20 more horsepower, you stick it in there.
There you go.
Whole new run. Gun was a big one. 50 millimeter was the Panzer 3s, which is fairly good on the Western Front.
Sure.
Not so much on the Eastern Front with the T-34s.
Right.
And what's worse is somebody in supply. It's always somebody in supply. We talked about that in the Civil War.
Right.
Somebody in supply was like, hey, we got a bunch of these 50 millimeter guns. Let's stick them on there because it'll save us a bunch of money. And they're like, okay. And the designer's like, no.
No.
Because he had a 50 millimeter gun that was high powered, was a longer cartridge. So basically, it was a Magnum.
There you go.
A 50 millimeter Magnum as opposed to the little 50 millimeter. And it showed the results were very obvious when you're fighting like a T-34. It was kind of like, well, the Americans. We had to get 5 or 6 Shermans to kill a Tiger.
Right.
Same thing for a T-34. You had to get 2 or 3 Panzer 3s
to kill one of those
things. Now, the good thing for the Germans is, of course, the Soviets didn't have real good training, so they didn't use their tanks very well until later in the war. Well, Uranos is probably the first time you see a very well-coordinated Soviet offensive. It's full of little disasters, tactical disasters, but the operational side
overall
really works fairly well. Of course, they win, so obviously it had to work somewhat.
Something went wrong.
So the Germans think with these new tanks coming off the assembly lines, they've built up enough of them, they've retrained their crews, they're going to just demolish. And they're going to go around the Soviet city of Kursk, which is west of Stalingrad, quite a ways actually. But there's a bulge, a Soviet bulge in the lines. And they're thinking if they cut that bulge off, we're talking probably 1 million plus Soviets gone.
Oh, wow.
And at this stage of the war,
that's bad.
It would have been very bad. So, but the problem is, Berlin is leaky. And this goes, there's a whole lot of people, you see it on the internet all the way, talking about the fact that, Nazis are right-wingers and communists are left-wingers. Well, unfortunately, the truth of the matter is they both spring out of the same kind of groups.
Yes.
At their early stages in the brown shirt eras of the 1920s,
Right.
people literally moved from the Communist Party to the Nazi Party without any issue.
Major change, right?
Economically speaking, they are the same.
Right.
They just control the economy a little bit differently. But it's still, the economy runs for the state, specifically the military of the state.
I used that actually not too long ago in a class lesson, talking about the political spectrum. I usually go with it in a circular pattern, not so much a linear pattern, but a circular pattern where again your socialists and your fascists or Nazis, whatever you would like to call them, are right there in the middle. And then at the 0 degree mark, and then of course you kind of fan out from there, and of course then the 180 would be kind of a moderate, if you will.
Yeah, well,
or something that would be right there in the middle.
It's why the line doesn't work very well.
No.
Because when you talk the difference between Nazis and communists, you're talking about nationalists versus internationalists.
Right.
That's really the major difference.
Right.
Is Nazis are very nationalistic.
Right.
And communists, despite the fact of socialism in one country,
they want to just take.
Their
they want
goal
to take over.
was the world.
Right.
And that borders shouldn't count.
No.
But anyway. But the problem is, in the German embassy in Tokyo,
of all places,
there is a spy, and I can't remember the code name, but he worked for the Soviets for the whole war.
Oh.
He obviously was out of position for the whole Barbarossa thing.
Of course.
But he was there for this one.
Yeah.
So he starts finding out about Operation Citadel, which is the Battle of Kursk plan on the German side. And so the Soviets start building a defense in depth at their flanks to prevent this pincer movement. So now instead of having the most strength up at the head,
right.
it's now down here at the bases where the Germans are going to try to cut it off.
Okay, makes sense.
They do anti-tank guns with belts of minefields, dug-in positions. They're ready by the time June rolls around.
Oh,
because
yeah.
the way the Soviet weather, Russian weather works,
it's
too wet to do anything until May at the earliest. Most of the time June. We see that in Barbarossa.
Yes.
We talked about the fact that he had to invade Yugoslavia and Greece being a delay, but it was it's like only 2 weeks because it wasn't until June that the roads were dry enough to use.
Right. Yeah.
So you don't want to do this driving these tanks. Now you've got the cool tanks though. These Panthers and Tigers, which can go across country much better.
Right.
But and it's a brutal battle, but the Germans don't come anywhere close to pincing off this battle. I mean, it goes for weeks, but the casualties are just huge on both sides. I mean, it's just, at this point of the war, it's watching a Packers-Bears game.
Just straight.
It doesn't matter what the score is. It doesn't matter if one of them's 0-15 and the other one's 15-0. It's going to be a bloodbath.
Right. They hate each other that much.
They hate each other that much. There's, unfortunately for, guys who just got drafted and sent to the front, there's not a lot of surrendering going on, at least individually. You got to surrender in a unit, otherwise they just tend to hose you down.
Oh yeah, I can imagine so.
And German engineers, of course, take a lot of casualties because they're getting out in front, trying to get rid of these minefields, trying to get their tanks through.
Yeah.
And I can't remember how many belts. I'm going to say it was 6 belts of defense.
Yes.
And on the north side, the Germans almost cracked the 6th belt. It's kind of one of those, just, if there would have been another company of Tigers, maybe they would have got through. But the Soviets held. And so by the time this battle is over, the German army, my book that I've got, Barbarossa, it's Alan Clark, probably the definitive work on the Eastern Front, talks about the fact that most likely after Stalingrad, the German army was pretty much spent as a true offensive force. That's too many guys to lose. And they were all combat troops.
Right.
Having a bunch of truck drivers is great because you need them, but that's not who takes over towns for you.
No, I was going to say, they're not really ones to be battle-hardened.
So, about the only good thing about Stalingrad is that, kind of like the United States in Pearl Harbor, our carriers were out. Most of the armor wasn't in Stalingrad by the time it fell. They had been pulled back to be regrouped, refitted,
Yes.
and retrained. So,
Right.
but that's this because of that leak.
The Russians, the Soviets,
because they
were ready.
knew it was coming 2 months before it came,
And they were able to prepare. They were able to get this fortifications where they needed to be. Just a little bit of statistics here about this battle. You'll notice again, we've talked a lot about the tanks. Over 6,000 tanks.
Yeah, it's the largest armored
involved.
battle in history.
6,000 tanks. I mean, think about that. It's in our modern interpretation of war, and if we're using tanks, especially like in the first Gulf War or anything along those lines. Do you know how many tanks we may have had in the first Gulf War when we were running through?
500 or 600.
Okay. So
I know
5 or 6.
At least 2 armor divisions. So
So you know, 2 armored divisions of American M1 Abrams tanks
Yeah.
going against a
I don't
nation
even
that
know.
was.
they had a lot of
terrible.
tanks, but
They weren't.
I
they
don't
weren't-
know by the time we went in with our tanks how many of those were left,
Right.
because the air battle had taken out a lot.
But even if you think about it, in 1943, when when the Germans are fighting against the Soviets, 6,000 of their tanks, and they still can't even break through.
Oh yeah,
You got 2 million troops and a large number of aircraft trying to get in and defeat the Soviets, but unfortunately it doesn't happen.
and it's the last time. Well, not the last time we'll see the finish in Korea, but it's the last time in the 20th, modern history that we see the total war.
Right.
Mass mobilization. Everybody who can is fighting, as opposed to what we've seen really Vietnam and on,
Right.
where it's a select few that are really going to fight,
True.
and the rest of the country goes on like
Nobody's been.
right.
Nobody's.
There's no rationing. There's no
Yeah. And that's
direct control of industry kind of stuff.
And that is something we probably should talk about later on about the rationing of,
Oh, yeah.
of course,
Yeah,
of how
but-
that really makes a
but
toll on
That's
everyone.
how you
but
get these numbers.
yeah, right.
I mean,
2 million troops, unreal.
Yeah, it's not something we would see today, most likely ever,
No,
because we're not in an era where you use that kind of, because everything's so expensive.
true.
But it's happened before. And you see that in the 1600s with the 30 Years War, things
True.
like that. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's a different discussion. But this battle finishes the German army on the eastern front.
Well, like we mentioned off camera beforehand, we see them slowly backtracking. They have to backpedal in order to protect themselves. The Germans are really in that defensive mode, whereas the Soviets are finally on the offensive.
Yeah, and really it's almost like a vacuum kind of thing. The power the power levels have changed so dramatically that now the high pressure, the Soviets, are pushing
Yes.
into the low pressure.
Right.
Because the Germans just don't have the guys to hold the length of line, the 1,600-mile long front kind of thing.
I'm sorry, that's too much.
It's way too much. And they're not going to go to trench warfare. 'Cause
Well-
it doesn't really work with tanks.
I'm sorry.
Not modern tanks.
No,
Anyway.
they saw that the tanks of World War One maybe
Yeah.
a little different because they were bigger and
Well, they
were
can only
able
go
to,
2 or 3 miles without
Yes.
breaking down.
Yes,
But with the newer tanks, the Tigers, the Panthers, the T-34s, the SUs, those self-propelled guns that the Soviets use,
it wouldn't work.
yeah, trenches wouldn't work anyway. The Germans, during this retreat, it's not like they're just passively walking back towards Berlin.
No.
Their counterattacks are vicious. They will let a Soviet army extend itself, and when it gets too far, it'll punch it in the nose or cut it off at the base, and suddenly you'll have a bunch of divisions that are no longer on the board for
There you go.
for the Soviets. But the problem is that works both ways now. The Soviets are getting good enough at handling large troop masses that they can do the same thing. So we go from the first part of the war where you have a single envelopment, where you
Yes.
just one line.
Yes.
By the end of the war, everything's double envelopment. You have a little offensive and a bigger offensive around it,
Wow.
because you've got to protect that inner
Right.
offensive. That's your real goal.
Right.
This is to make sure that doesn't get cut off.
There you go.
It's
Which then increases your troop numbers, which increases your supplies, which increases everything.
well, in 43 we start actually seeing, because of the pressure on Germany from the air war over Germany,
Mm-hmm.
we start seeing a Soviet Air Force again.
Weird.
I mean, they'd used little planes, spy planes, basically
Mhm.
little biplanes from World War One, really, that would harass Germans and stuff. And you had the Sturmovik, which is basically the Soviet version of a Stuka, a
Okay.
dive bomber,
Mm-hmm.
heavily armored,
Mm-hmm.
kind of the predecessor to our A-10 Warthog. Takes a lot of damage, keeps on flying. Very simple plane.
Yeah.
Which works best.
Right.
Less things break when you make it simple.
The simpler, the better for everything.
Yeah, but you see this, but it doesn't change much. You just lost too many men, too much equipment.
Right.
Now it's going to take a miracle. And the weird part about it is that really since Stalingrad that's been true, and we see Hitler more and more often going to that single roll of the dice to try to win the war on a single thing. And that's just not doable. We see that on both fronts. Nobody has the ability to knock the opponent out of the war quickly. It's just too much space,
Yes.
too many people to go, well, I'm going to sweep around here and it'll be over. I mean, even if Stalingrad would have fallen to the Germans,
You wouldn't
the
have.
Soviets wouldn't have just quit.
No.
They would have went to the other side of the river and started over.
Exactly. It's not anything that would have ever just. You don't see the style of warfare that we've seen in the century beforehand, where if you take the capital,
Yes.
the army will fall. Napoleon tried taking Moscow, and of course he did get into Moscow, but
They burned it around his ears,
there you go.
which was good because it kept his ears warm.
Right. But the thing is, of course, just because he takes the capital does not mean that the army will fall.
Right.
Again, it's this mentality now that we're in a total war. We're in an idea that everybody and anyone will be fighting for, well, motherland, fatherland, whichever side of the European era you're on.
But, I mean, that makes a really good point because we've reached I guess you would say, the height of nationalism.
Correct.
And for all of nationalism's faults, it gives this resiliency to
Yes.
nations
Yes.
that you don't see before that, where, well, the king's gone, so I can go back to being Burgundian
Right.
or Britain.
No, it's
Now I'm going to be French
Yes.
or American. I'm not going to be from Tennessee.
No.
That happens to be where I'll be from, but if I'm overseas, I'm an American.
right.
And it's really, you see that with the Soviets. You see it with the Germans to a certain large extent too,
Mhm.
as we go further into the war. But it's nationalism. It does give it that resilience that you're no longer tied to Berlin
No.
or Moscow.
No,
or,
you are a Russian or well,
and I mean Joe Stalin, who was Mr. Communist, had been crushing these minorities and Christians and Jews and anybody else got in his way. But really, he was really mostly about communism and crushing those little ideas.
right.
The war starts and suddenly the churches are open.
Yes.
The minorities are encouraged in their Russian identification.
Hmm.
You can be, a Ukrainian Russian or a Georgian, like him.
Yes. Yes.
like him.
Right. Or or
It was.
anyone.
He did basically anything he could to lessen the issues of division in his country.
Well, you have to
Which
if you're
is-
going to win a war.
Very liberal for Joe.
Yes.
I mean, that's like tantamount to declaring your weakness or something.
Exactly.
But I think we see really the trend of the war, and 43 is that balancing point.
Yes.
Even though all those crucial turning point battles have occurred, the Allies don't have enough oomph to finish the war quickly. So we're kind of in this breathing period, except on
Right.
the Eastern Front, of
Right. Well, they've kind of been backwards for some time,
course. Mhm.
taking the invasion of Germany, and of course
Yeah.
it took them a little bit of time.
Yes. And I think when we go forward from here, we're going to talk about the Pacific.
Yes, the Pacific in 1943 specifically, meeting up into 44.
Getting up into 44. Then after that, we're going to just go back to Europe and we're going to finish the war.
Yes.
And then we're going to go
Race
back to the
45.
Pacific and finish the war.
Right.
Rather than keep trying to jump back and forth, because things start happening really quickly.
Right.
And it'll give us a chance to dig a little deeper into some of this stuff
For sure.
without worrying about, oh, well, we're going to run over time and then we're not going to be able to get to
Wherever.
the Marianas
yes,
or
yes.
Manila or whatever.
Right.
So we're just going to focus on Germany not this next episode. The next episode, we're still back in the Pacific, but then after that, we're going forward.
Yes.
All the way to May of 1945.
Correct.
Then who knows after that?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us again. Make sure that you like, follow, and share.